It is always a little problematic for me to introduce our next speaker because we became friends at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in the mid-1970s, and that just reminds me how much time has passed since that. John at the time was a pre-doctoral fellow working on his doctorate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. While doing his fellowship at FPRI, he went on to become executive editor, a senior fellow at FPRI, and then went on and joined the U.S. Naval War College, where eventually he became chairman of the strategy department, which he served a term of about 8 years, which he completed earlier this year. And if you recall Walter's opening remarks about the origins of the term Middle East being coined by Alfred Thayer Mahan, John is the Alfred Thayer Mahan Professor of Sea Power and Grand Strategy at the Naval War College. Last year, he gave a lecture for us at the New York Historical Society on Churchill and the road to Pearl Harbor. And the chairman of the society came up to me at the end and said he would like to do a whole series of lectures with us at the society, which is a great museum in Manhattan. But the only thing is he wanted John Maurer to do all the lectures in the series. So you're in for a treat. John is going to talk about Churchill and the origins of the modern Middle East. So please welcome John Maurer.
Good morning. I am going to give you a perspective. That perspective is of the outside imperial power looking in on the Middle East. I'm going to give you the perspective of a global power, a superpower, because the Middle East, while important to Britain in the early part of the 20th century, was not the only concern that Britain had as a global superpower. So I'm going to talk this morning about a superpower who has vital interests in the Middle East and how they tried to manage, control the Middle East to suit their interests. And in particular, I'm going to focus on one statesman of that superpower, Winston Churchill. Now, we are most familiar with Winston Churchill during the Second World War, when he was leader of Britain in the fight against Nazi Germany. But before he became prime minister in May of 1940, Churchill had already had a long and illustrious, and some would say failed, career as a statesman, leader in both war and peace. And here is a photograph of Churchill in 1919. Don't you love that top hat? Surrounded by his generals. Churchill in 1919 was made Secretary of State for War and Air, basically Secretary of Defense, in charge of the War and Air Ministries. And here he is surrounded by generals on an inspection tour of the Rhineland in 1919, after the end of the Great War. First, however, we're all teachers. Pop quiz. We have to have a pop quiz. Here's 11 points here. Name that country. It's a global superpower. It's a dominant naval power. Suffers from sluggish economic growth and high unemployment. Political left wants more social benefits. Right wants tax cuts, balanced budget. Defense spending being driven down. Fighting insurgencies. Also, look at that heavy indebtedness to another great power. Leaders and people fear attacks on the homeland. Okay, name that country. U.S. today, Britain between the wars, neither of the above, both of the above. Should I take a vote? No. Anyway, good starting point for discussion, though, to think about history. This is one of the big questions, right, of history we as teachers like to deal with. Does history repeat itself? When I pose this question, often I get a number of people who jump up and say, yes, yes, yes. But, here's a catechism. Does history repeat itself? Answer, No. History doesn't repeat itself. There might be patterns in history that we see, but circumstances change, people change. Nothing exactly repeats itself over and over again. But then that leads to a question: why do we study history? Why do we have the profession that we do? Why do we explore history? Is it just some antiquarian interest that we have? Or can it help us to be better thinkers about today? Well, this is a question that goes back many years, 2,500 years, in fact. Here is a bust of the ancient Greek historian Thucydides. Thucydides was a general in Athens, took part in wars between Athens and Sparta, so-called Peloponnesian War. Indeed, Thucydides was a very bad general. He presided over a major Athenian military defeat. He was sacked by the Athenian people, and so he gave up his military career to become a best-selling author. And his book has been in print ever since, his History of the Peloponnesian War. Now, he had to grapple with this problem. As he was writing his book, he said, is this just a history I'm writing of my own time, my own experience, or am I writing something that might last longer and be of greater use to other generations? In other words, will it pass that muster that we have of a great book or a classic? Does it withstand the test of time? And Thucydides said, yes, it can withstand the test of time, because even though history doesn't repeat itself, the study of history enables us to think about peoples in other times, imaginatively to put ourselves in their shoes, to think about the problems that they faced, and then to bring that experience, the experience of others, to bring that experience to bear on our own lifetime, our own circumstances. We at the War College like to say that you can have an analytical toolkit, that the study of history, historical cases, provides you with that toolkit, a metaphor, to help analyze and think about current day problems. Well, one of the analytical tools that Thucydides gave was, why do great wars occur? Why did the great wars of his lifetime occur? And he came up with a Trinity answer, that people's leaders fight out of these three things. Three major considerations: honor, fear, and interest. What do we mean by honor? Well, commitment to something. Commitment to something that you believe in. If you don't believe in something, what do you believe in? What are you willing to stand up and fight for? Sometimes it can be a coalition partner. Again, in that sense, it could be credibility, is a word that we use today. A country stands by its words, by its commitments to other peoples that it might have pledged to defend. Fear. Well, that's clear, isn't it? All people want security in their lives. Security. Security can mean well-being, but it can also mean fear of attack. You're afraid of someone who might attack you. Interest or self-interest. Yeah, there's calculations. Calculations. Is it in my interest? Notice that sometimes self-interest and honor might be opposed to each other. The honorable thing to do might be to protect an ally. But what if the cost of doing it is too high? Self-interest might dictate, throw the ally under the bus. It's not worth defending them if the cost is going to be too high. Because in the real world, we face trade-offs. We face interests, commitments, credibility, but we also have to look at the other side of the ledger sheet, which is the cost of any commitment. So Thucydides lays out this trinity. It's a wonderful trinity to think about the world in which we live in. And indeed, it has informed decision makers for many, many years. The ancient Romans actually read Thucydides. You'll see that ancient Roman generals would discuss their strategic problems by making reference to Thucydides. And here we see the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, who is a close reader of Thucydides, went before Congress about 18 months ago to talk about Iran. And he said, hey, Thucydides has something to say about Iran. What does he have to say? Fear, honor, interest. Put yourself in the leaders in Tehran. What honor mean to them? What does fear mean to them? What do interests mean? Again, it's a starting point for analysis, for trying to understand the world. So again, Thucydides can help inform us down to the current day. Okay, let me look at the international environment at the beginning of the 20th century, 100 years ago. And here you had this superpower, Britain, the home islands. Churchill would say the heart and center of an empire that stretched around the globe. To the north, the great prosperous Dominion, Canada, and the British Empire in Asia. We don't think of the British Empire in this way, but one way to conceptualize, look at the British Empire, is an empire that is built around the Indian Ocean. An Indian Ocean littoral empire, stretching from New Zealand and Australia through Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Asia, modern-day Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, through the Gulf, Red Sea, all the way down to South Africa. Now, what links the North Atlantic and the British homeland to this empire in Asia? Well, the Middle East is right in between, right? So for Britain to have this global empire, this empire upon which the sun never set, Britain has to have secure lines of communication between the home islands and that empire in South Asia around the Indian Ocean. Hence the importance of what they would call the Near East, as opposed to the Far East out in East Asia. And then the Middle East in between, as Mahan called it. Well, British power in the world is based on naval dominance. Britain fought a series of wars against rival peer competitors, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and at the end of the Napoleonic Wars had emerged as the world's leading naval power, having the strongest navy in the world. The Battle of Trafalgar, 21st October 1805, they say that half the safes in Britain can be unlocked by putting in 21-10-5. They say the other half of the safes can be unlocked by 06-1815, June 18th, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, because all British history students know those two dates. I don't know whether that's true or not. I've never tried to open safes in Britain. But nonetheless, Britain's power in the world is based upon naval dominance, won at hard expense in the 18th and early 19th century over these rivals. And again, the Battle of Trafalgar conferred upon, where the British beat a French and Spanish fleet off Cape Trafalgar near Gibraltar, that conferred upon Britain this naval dominance for the Napoleonic Wars, and also a legacy of being the world's dominant naval power for another century. But by the beginning of the 20th century, Britain's naval dominance is being challenged by other rivals, serious challengers, and in particular, Germany, right across the North Sea, an immediate direct threat to the British homeland. The German fleet was being built up before the First World War, purposely against Britain. And British leaders looked at this and said, this is a serious threat. It's an immediate one. And indeed, Winston Churchill, who became First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy in 1911, looked upon this as being a serious challenge to Britain's world position, a challenge right at home, in home waters. And as he wrote after the war, after the First World War, that this German Navy was being built up, and it was creating what we today would call a Cold War between Germany and Britain. Exertions, vigilance, almost as tense as that of actual war. British leaders feared, Churchill in particular feared, that the next war with Germany would begin with a surprise attack on the British fleet in home waters, a Pearl Harbor-like attack on the Royal Navy, that's how the next war would begin. So they were afraid of this initial first strike by German leaders. Well, how do you stay ahead of a rival? Well, Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, beginning in 1911, embarked on a program of what we would call transformation, trying to make the Royal Navy stay ahead of this emerging rival from Germany. So he had a very ambitious program to galvanize the Royal Navy so that the Royal Navy wasn't just resting on its laurels of the Battle of Trafalgar from 100 years before, but that the Royal Navy was a modern instrument of war able to take on and defeat this serious challenge coming from a major industrial technological rival in Imperial Germany. Now, he had a whole big program of reform at the Navy, which I can't talk about today in any length, but I want to focus on that technological innovation, and in particular, building a new generation, the latest generation, the most heavily armed battleships. This is one way you stay ahead of your rival, by outgunning your rival, by having more firepower, greater armor, protection, higher speed. You want to have the best weaponry that you can have. You want to stay a generation ahead of your enemies when it comes to weaponry. And so Churchill wanted to have the very best weapons to confront the Germans at sea. So when he became First Lord of the Admiralty, one of the questions that he had to do was to approve a new generation of battleships. Now, these battleships were going to be fueled by oil. Oil would enable the Royal Navy to have this warships that would be able to outclass the Germans. But it meant shifting the Royal Navy from its principal fuel of coal to oil. And this was serious because, of course, Britain has no oil at that time in their home islands. They have plenty of coal. In fact, they have the world's best maritime coal from Wales. Britain at this time is the Saudi Arabia of coal. So you're moving away from something that's safe and secure, an energy supply in your own home islands, to where you have to reach out somewhere else to get that oil fuel. So the implications of staying ahead of the Germans in armaments requires that you find oil. And again, this decision is an important one because it means taking a risk. It means taking a risk. And indeed, as he says, this is like a hazard in wartime, but it's being waged under conditions of peace, making sure that you have that generation of weaponry ahead of any opponent. So it means finding oil. Well, Churchill turned to a retired admiral by the name of Admiral Fisher, Lord Fisher of Kilverstone, also known as Jackie Fisher. Here's a portrait of him. You can see from that portrait, what does that tell you about him? This is a determined, ruthless man. He is an incredible advocate of technological innovation, pushing the Royal Navy into the 20th century. Wireless, radio, oil, submarines, high speed. Very determined figure. And indeed, brooks no opposition within the Navy, makes a lot of enemies by his attempt to transform the Royal Navy. Retired, but Churchill turns to him and says, "Hey, Fisher, my dear Fisher, this liquid fuel problem, we have to solve it." And he turns to him and says, I want to appoint you to a royal commission to find the oil. Now, there's plenty of oil in the Western Hemisphere from the United States, but do you want to be dependent upon another potentially rival great power in the United States? And the answer is no. You want to find your own sources of oil. As Churchill says to Fisher when he asked him to sign up, he says, you've got to find that oil. How can it be stored cheaply, purchased regularly, in peace and in war? Clear mandate to find out how they can solve this oil problem. Today, Senator McCain, writing in his book called Hard Call, looks at this decision to shift the Royal Navy, its battleships from coal to oil, as being an example, a case study that should be examined of transformation. Indeed, he's very impressed by Churchill taking this risk. And again, he calls it, though, not a crazy risk, but a calculated risk. That Churchill wasn't afraid to be bold. And indeed, that is a good characterization of Churchill's leadership. He was not afraid to be bold. But again, a calculated risk, not a crazy risk. Okay, well, where are you going to get some of the oil? Well, let's look at the Middle East and the Balkans. British interests, again, lines of communication through the Suez Canal from Europe out to Asia. Now, oil from the Gulf. That's where Britain's going to get its oil. Britain wants to have the oil of the Middle East. It's newly discovered. That's going to fuel its battleships. So the Middle East is starting to loom in importance, in particular the Gulf. And of course, Britain is also concerned about the Straits, because they're a threat. Whoever controls the Straits, the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, the Sea of Marmara, whoever controls that controls, well, a Russian fleet going out into the Mediterranean against British sea lines of communication. Well, what about Britain's rivals in this region? How about Germany's imperial ambitions? Talked about the buildup of the German Navy against Britain, but Germany also posed a threat in the Middle East and the Balkans. Germany wanted to drive a railway, the so-called Berlin to Baghdad Railway. It was also helping to rebuild the Ottoman army. Lehmann von Sanders, a German general, was sent in 1913 to Istanbul to help reorganize, re-equip the army, Ottoman army, so that it can stand against, well, all comers, but in particular, Russia. So here is a threat that Britain has to manage. And indeed, British diplomacy before the First World War is to try to work with Germany, as well as compete with Germany, to manage this rivalry in the Middle East. Indeed, while Germany is building up the Ottoman army, the British are selling battleships to the Ottomans as well. Now, who's the other great imperial power? Russia, which has ambitions in the region as well, in the Balkans, toward the Straits. For them, whoever controls the Straits also controls the ability to attack the Russian Empire in the Black Sea and through the Caucasus to the Middle East. So Britain, as an imperial power, faces a challenge from both Russia and Germany. Britain's trying, before the First World War in its diplomacy, to manage that rivalry with Russia as well, signing an Entente agreement, an arrangement of spheres of influence in 1907 with Russia to, in effect, partition up Persia, to settle regions. Where are you going to have the dominant influence? Where is Russia? Where Britain? So you can see there's a triangular rivalry going on here in the Middle East that British leaders are concerned about. Well, 100 years ago, next June 28, 1914, an incident in the Balkans triggers the outbreak of the First World War. The outrage in Sarajevo, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb by the name of Gavrilo Princip kills the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. This sets in train the so-called July crisis that leads to the outbreak of the First World War. It's a war that originally starts as a fight between Austria-Hungary, Germany's principal ally, and Serbia, backed up by Russia. This leads from an Austro-Hungarian-Serbian war to a larger war between Germany and Russia in the July crisis, and then Germany converts it from a war in Eastern Europe and the Balkans into a larger war by attacking France through Belgium, bringing France into the war and also Britain. So you have the outbreak of the First World War being triggered by events in this region. Eastern Europe is dragging Western Europe into a world war. Well, once the war begins, Britain, as an ally of Russia against Germany, looks to say, well, how can we help Russia? Well, the Ottoman Empire comes into the war on the side of Germany. So Britain, to help Russia, is looking for ways to help Russia. On January 1st, 1915, the Russian Grand Duke Nicholas, who was in charge of the Russian armies, sends an appeal to the British leaders and says, our armies aren't doing well on the Eastern Front against the Germans. They're also not doing well in the Caucasus. Can we have help? Can you launch some sort of demonstration against the Ottoman Empire that will pull away some of their forces from the Caucasus? As it turns out, the Russian armies do rather well in the Caucasus. But the British leaders say, what can we do to help our Russian ally? Well, one of the strategies that's proposed is to launch an assault toward Istanbul. Seize the Gallipoli Peninsula, which you can see there, break through the Dardanelles, and go on to Istanbul. Go right to the enemy's capital. This is sort of classic military thought. You drive toward the enemy's capital, you bring the main enemy forces to bear in battle, defeat them, and then they will capitulate. They will give up the fight. Well, this is the thinking behind the so-called Dardanelles or Gallipoli campaign. Winston Churchill embraced this. Initially, he had some doubts about it, but eventually he jumped on board and thought that this was a good idea, a way of helping Russia, but also knocking out one of Britain's enemies in this war. Well, it proved to be harder to do in practice. The Turks had mined the waters of the Dardanelles, and they had gun emplacements on both sides, narrow waters. It's turned out to be a very difficult problem. Was it a problem that couldn't be solved? No, it actually could have been solved if the British had been more competent at this. But the story of the Dardanelles campaign, don't get me going, it is one of the most mismanaged campaigns you can imagine. It is a great case study of one military blunder after another. Well, the British decide to launch a naval attack to force the Dardanelles to go through these minefields. You have to sweep the mines, you have to suppress the gun batteries. It's a real chicken and egg problem that has to be done here. Well, on March 18th, 1915, there is a major naval offensive that takes place. And indeed, we have some photographs of the British and French fleet that try to force the Dardanelles steaming forward. Indeed, the Queen Elizabeth, this is one of these new oil-fired battleships, is taking the lead in the assault. This is an incredibly stupid thing, by the way, because you're putting your latest generation of weaponry into waters that are heavily mined where it could be lost. I look at this and I go, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? Well, they were thinking that the Queen Elizabeth's 15-inch guns would be able to overawe and destroy the Turkish gun batteries there. And there, some of the 15-inch guns of the Queen Elizabeth, very powerful. And the Queen Elizabeth, as you can see, in the midst, maelstrom of fire, trying to suppress the Turkish gun batteries, while minesweepers, actually North Sea fishermen and trawlers, reservists called up, using their nets instead of bringing up herring, they're going to bring up mines, trying to sweep the minefields. Again, very close range, heavy artillery, just incredible when you look at the photographs. Well, several British battleships hit mines and sunk. One French battleship, the Bouvet, hits a mine as well and sinks. In this assault on the Dardanelles on March 18th, it's a failure. 4 battleships lost, 650 men killed, 600 of them French on the Bouvet. When it hits a mine, capsizes and sinks. Well, if the Navy can't do it, well, then the Army can. So on April 25th, 1915, there's an assault on Gallipoli Peninsula to try to seize the high ground overlooking the Dardanelles. Well, the Army doesn't do much better. Indeed, here's a photograph of Australian troops going over the top. The Army assaults fail as well. And these are mythic in the history of Australia and New Zealand. In fact, Anzac Day in Australia and New Zealand commemorates these assaults of April 25th, 1915. Now, why did the ground offensives fail? Well, here are some factors that account for the failure at the Dardanelles. Well, who's responsible for all of this? If something goes wrong, somebody has to be thrown under the bus, right? That's the world of politics. Somebody has to be blamed when things don't go right. Well, here are the casualties, by the way, for the Gallipoli campaign. Well, the person who gets thrown under the bus is Winston Churchill by his political colleagues. He was seen as the most avid advocate of this campaign that has now failed. And so he resigns from government. He is considered the architect of the failure of the Dardanelles. After the war, in his history of the First World War called The World Crisis, when he wrote about this, he said this was a great idea. It was just poorly executed. And indeed, Britain had within its capabilities to execute it. It could have been done better. It could have succeeded. Well, from the First World War, what are the casualties figures? When people say First World War, how many people died? Well, 10 million people approximately died in uniform. Here's the totals. 5 million or so on the side fighting against Germany and its allies. And the Central Powers on the other side, over 4 million. So about 10 million fatalities of people in uniform. But in addition to those killed in uniform, there's a larger body count. About 10 million non-combatants, primarily in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. Also in the ensuing Russian Civil War, you have more people killed in the Russian Civil War than are killed in those in uniform in the First World War. And then you have this pandemic, flu pandemic, that hits the world, beginning in late 1917, stretching into the early 20s. I give you the low figure of 25 million worldwide. Some authorities put the number up to 70 million from the pandemic. Today, when our national security leaders talk about the threat of pandemics, they're looking back to this great influenza outbreak and the horrendous loss of life that caused. As you can see, Mother Nature is a greater killer of human beings than humans are of other humans. Indeed, when you look at the fatality figures for the United States in this time, more people are killed by the flu than are killed on the battlefields of France for the United States. By the way, if you look at the newspaper headlines for this time, it's really fascinating. I've gone through the Philadelphia newspapers, and what you see is the war news on the Western Front takes front page, and then the stories about the flu are all back on pages 2, 3, hidden away, and yet actually the greater killer is the pandemic. Okay, remembering the war. Here's the cenotaph in London, commemoration to the great losses. You can still see this today in London, of course, in the center of Whitehall. Again, the great loss of the First World War in Europe and European civilization. This is seen as the war that has ripped out the guts of Western civ and created all the pathologies that are going to come and lead to the Second Great World War. Britain emerged from the war battered, heavy losses, but masters of the world. They've survived. They've won. Indeed, if you go to the National Portrait Gallery in London, this is one of the great paintings that you'll see there. If you've not been to the National Portrait Gallery, the next time you go to London, it's right off Trafalgar Square. It's a famous painting by Sir James Guthrie. And here you see the British leaders, political leaders of the First World War. A remarkably talented group of individuals. Indeed, one reason why Britain defeats Germany is that Britain really does have better leaders than Germany does in this war on the political side. See Arthur Balfour there, the Balfour Declaration standing there. You see David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, off to the left. And a Winston Churchill, almost in the center. Look at him, he's looking right out at us. He's looking right out at us. When you see this in the National Portrait, it's very moving to look at this. It's fascinating. And indeed, when you look at this and you realize this is painted right after the First World War, and Churchill's looking out at you, it's almost as if he's looking out at a future, a troubled future. Again, that's not a happy face that he has. David Lloyd George, Walter McDougall mentioned him. Britain's prime minister, great war leader, became prime minister at the end of 1916. He's seen as the one that is the architect of victory for Britain in this war. His popularity when the war ends is immense, immense. He is a liberal in charge of a coalition government made up of some liberals and conservatives, much like today's British government, a coalition of liberals and conservatives. The difference being that the prime minister is from the minority Liberal Party rather than from the majority Conservative Party. And one of his right-hand go-to guys is Winston Churchill. After the war, Churchill was asked by Lloyd George to be the Secretary of State for War and Air, to be in charge of the Army and the Royal Air Force. He wrote about this period in a book called The Aftermath, the 6th volume in his massive history of the First World War called The World Crisis. This is the 6th volume of a series of books that Churchill wrote during the 1920s about the First World War. You can get it today in a one-volume paperback edition. It is well worth reading. Well, how was Churchill's appointment as Secretary of State of War received at the time? Well, from the conservative Morning Post, look what they have to say. A brilliant individual, but erratic. And he makes a mess of everything. This is not the view that we have of Churchill today, is it? We see him as the person who defies Hitler. Well, again, in 1919, he makes a mess of things. And why? Because character is destiny. It's something in the DNA of Churchill. He has a tragic flaw that he's on every occasion, not just on some occasions, every occasion, he's on the wrong course. And oh, by the way, this appointment makes us tremble. Fearful for the British Empire. What a bad appointment. And indeed, Churchill quipped to Bernard Law, who was the head of the Conservatives, and said, you know, Andrew, it's not nearly as much fun to be Secretary of State for War in peacetime than in war. And Bernard Law said, hey, if there was a real war going on, we wouldn't appoint you Secretary of State for War. We wouldn't make you hold such a responsible position. Again, Churchill is seen as erratic, unreliable, brilliant, but still flawed in judgment. Well, one of the reasons why Lloyd George appointed him to be Secretary of State for War is that the British Army had expanded by conscription to fight the First World War. Large army, over 5 million soldiers in uniform. Well, it has to be demobbed, demobilized. Go back to an all-volunteer force, which is the British tradition. Well, a lot of people who have been mobilized, they don't want to serve. They want to go home right away once the armistice has been signed. The result is that soldiers on leave in Britain who were being sent back to France after the armistice said, heck no, we're not going. We want to stay home. So there were mutinies and a lot of disturbances in the British Army. Now, what's the response of the British High Command? Field Marshal Douglas Haig. Shoot them. This is mutiny. The response to breaks in discipline like this is to round up the usual suspects, those ringleaders, and shoot them. Because otherwise the Army's morale will suffer. That's the response. Now, the armistice has been signed, but he's not talking about shooting large numbers, but he wants to get those ringleaders. Churchill's response is, no, the hard hand isn't the right one here. Again, there are occasions when the death penalty might be required, but this is not one of those examples where the death penalty is required. And indeed, he says, I don't know how I could explain this to the public. Because as Secretary of State for War, he has to explain to the public why they're taking the steps that they are. And he said, unless it's criminal, cowardly, some violence has been used. And by the way, there's next to no violence on the part of these resistors who don't want to go back to France. Churchill says, this doesn't call for the death penalty. Well, Haig in his diary says, I'm not going to let any telegram from my boss tell me what I should do. I have it in my authority to shoot people if I want to. As it turns out, Haig does not shoot the ringleaders because he has gotten a telegram from his boss that has made clear that should not be the response. Again, Churchill's stepping into a very dangerous situation where things could spiral and get out of control. But instead, by adopting a much more lenient approach toward these problems, the result is that morale is restored to the Army without any major disturbances. Another concern that Britain has at this time is how do you bring down the defense budget in the aftermath of a great war? Obviously, Britain isn't going to spend wartime levels of expenditure in peacetime. So in August of 1919, and this is the document from the public records of what used to be called the Public Record Office, now the National Archives in Kew in Britain, the so-called 10-year rule. And on the front page it says, hey, defense services, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, for planning purposes, will plan on the assumption that there will be no major war for the next 10 years. No more war like the war they've just fought against Germany. Indeed, it's probably going to be reinstituted every year, too, so that this keeps rolling out. This is a way for the government to get a handle on the British defense budget, to drive down defense expenditures. Because if you're not planning for a major war in 10 years' time, the result is you can drive down dramatically defense spending. Do you have to do the type of transformation of buying new capital ships, battleships? No. You can experiment, but you don't actually have to buy. You can also drive down your personnel costs by shrinking the size of your armed forces as well. So this becomes an important guidance to the defense services. So to understand this period, you have to take on board that British defense chiefs are trying to do things as cheaply as possible. They want to find ways to hold down defense expenditures. Now, the three great leaders who bring about the end of the First World War, Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, and our President Woodrow Wilson. In the aftermath, Churchill wrote, yeah, these three men, masters of the world. Victory was in their hands. What are they going to do with it? Well, the Treaty of Versailles of June 1918, Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. You can see Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Wilson. Meanwhile, sitting right in the front, it's hard to see, but there he is a German delegate being forced to sign, stoop-shouldered. What a great embarrassment this is for Germany, being asked to sign this treaty, which they call a diktat, a dictation, that they're the defeated power, that they are uniquely responsible for the war. Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty says that Germany is uniquely responsible for this war. Indeed, why is this an embarrassment? Well, in January of 1871, the German Empire, the newly unified German state, had been proclaimed in Versailles, in the very same Hall of Mirrors. And as you can see here, the great German statesman, Bismarck in the white uniform, who was the architect, political architect of this. Next to him, the great German general, Helmut von Moltke, and King William of Prussia, who becomes Wilhelm I of Imperial Germany. The very same hall where the German Empire came into existence during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Imagine this. The German Empire is proclaimed not in Berlin, but in Versailles, in France, because the German armies and the court are in France fighting a war against France. Now, in 1919, that German Empire is being dictated to again in Versailles. And the signature of David Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson on the Versailles settlement. Well, what should Britain's foreign policy strategy be? Churchill writes an article at this time, at the time of the Versailles settlement, and he says, first and foremost, Britain and the United States have to continue to work together. The United States pulsed an immense amount of power into Europe during the First World War. Over 2 million soldiers went to France. The American army in France in the fall of 1918 was larger than the French army. This showed American power in the world, that the United States was not only an economic superpower, but had the potential to be a great military superpower. And again, for Churchill, close relations between Britain and the United States are important. Secondly, that Britain and the United States should work to reassure France that it suffered grievously during the war, that Germany should be reconciled to its defeat. You know, one of the things we teach in our strategy courses, when do you know when a war is over? Well, it's when your enemy agrees to that. In other words, you don't control when a war ends. Your enemy controls when the war ends. They agree that the war should end. How do you reconcile the German people? Well, again, a soft peace is what Churchill wanted. Meanwhile, from the east is a danger from communism, because the Russian imperial regime, the Tsarist regime, has been overthrown, first by a republic and then by a communist, a Bolshevik tyranny. And so Churchill is saying, let's put together what amounts to a North Atlantic alliance, the United States, Britain, France, to look out for a danger coming from the east, from communism. This could have been written in 1945. As you can see, Churchill in 1919, who's also a statesman of the Cold War, Already those views that he has about geopolitics are shaped in the aftermath of the First World War. Well, how do you deal with America, though? America is also a rival. Talked about the oil rivalry. You want to have sources of oil that are secure, independent from the United States. Well, here's Churchill in 1918 giving a speech to his constituents in the Scottish fishing industrial town of Dundee up in Scotland. And he says, hey, you know why we won this war? The Royal Navy. Britain should never give up that naval supremacy. Country's existence, its empire. Again, it's back to Trafalgar again. A League of Nations is no substitute for the dominance of the British fleet. Now, who's the big proponent of the League of Nations? Woodrow Wilson, right? The American president. Churchill is openly, publicly saying, hey, a League of Nations is a great idea, but you want to secure the peace, Britain has to remain strong on the world's oceans. Well, who does this rile? Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was coming over to Britain, to Europe, to be part of the peace settlement, negotiate the peace settlement, and he heard about Churchill's speech as he's coming over. Wilson got very angry, and one of his assistants recorded in her diary, said, well, if that's the British attitude of the British government and people like Churchill, well, we're going to build the biggest navy in the world. We'll show the Brits, because we have the resources to outbuild Britain. Indeed, if Britain doesn't concede in some way this dominance that they have, share dominance in the world's ocean, the result will be another world war and the British Empire will be wiped off the face of the map. Wow, it's pretty harsh language there coming from Woodrow. Well, later at Buckingham Palace, he runs into Churchill, and President Wilson starts pulling Churchill's legs and saying, hey, how's the Royal Navy doing, Mr. Churchill? Apparently Churchill was flustered by it. Again, this relationship between the United States and Britain is often a troubled one. We call it a special relationship, but there's a lot of rivalry and competition there in this period of time. And indeed, Churchill, again, in another speech about naval spending, says, hey, we don't want to antagonize the United States. But at the same time, Britain, because it has this global empire connected by sea lines of communication, Britain has a special security requirement to have the world's dominant naval power. And that Britain has to be able to stand up on its own feet by being the world's dominant naval power. And only by having that strength can Britain walk, as he says, hand in hand with the United States. Not as a satellite state of the United States in this special relationship, but as an equal. Britain should never be a supplicant to the United States. Again, after the First World War, Churchill is trying to stand up for the British Empire against the United States, as well as other rivals. By the 1950s, Churchill realized that the British Empire can no longer be an equal of the United States, that the mantle of leadership of the global dominant superpower has shifted from Britain to the United States. Okay, I've talked about a range of issues Britain's leaders face after the war, reconstructing Europe, rivalry with the United States, but there's also what Churchill called the poison peril from the East. Communism, Lenin, the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia, that this is a new form of that rivalry that Britain has had with Russia, but it's made more dangerous because who's come to power? Well, the communists, and Lenin himself in his own words is saying, hey, one system or the other is going to win out. This is an ideological struggle. Either capitalism will win or communism. It's one or the other. One or the other. It's a zero-sum game, ultimately, this struggle that Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, is going to have, communism is going to have with the rest of the world. And indeed, here's Lenin sweeping the world clean of all these scoundrels. Well, for Churchill, Lenin is an evil dictator. He's the great repudiator, as he calls him. Repudiates everything. Customs of centuries, contracts, the whole structure of human society. Now Churchill runs into difficulties with his prime minister, his boss, Lloyd George, because Churchill wants to support the anti-Bolshevik forces within Russia in the Russian Civil War. And indeed, arms and equipment are being given to the so-called whites against the reds. Well, Lloyd George goes along with this to an extent, but then realizes that, hey, this is a losing proposition. And whatever the commitment is to the whites, it's not worth it. Again, we would say honor as opposed to self-interest. Churchill is going, it's a dishonorable thing to let the whites lose out to the reds. Well, the prime minister says, hey, I've had it with you, Churchill, when it comes to Russia. This has been an overextension of British power, something that Britain can't afford. And oh, by the way, the whites are all incompetents and they're going to lose, no matter how much aid we give to them. We've got to get on better terms with the communists, with Lenin. Churchill doesn't like this idea at all. In public, he's very clear. Well, one writer, public philosopher, writer, H.G. Wells, came back from Soviet Russia and says, hey, Soviets are doing some good things out there. And Churchill attacked H.G. Wells, and this is what H.G. Wells had back to say. He says, hey, it distresses me about Churchill. He shouldn't be in office. This guy's crazy. Again, this is an example often thrown in Churchill's face that, oh, he's lacking in judgment, picking the wrong side, backing losers in a civil war. Well, after winning in the Civil War, Soviet forces start moving into Eastern Europe, into Poland. This very much concerns Churchill because he can see a red tide coming into Poland. And it's not clear at all that the Poles are going to be able to stop the Soviets in this war between Poland and Soviet Russia. You know, and to Lord Riddle, who's one of the big press barons, a Rupert Murdoch of his day, Churchill confides that, hey, this is dangerous, this Bolshevik danger to civilization. Lord Riddle's diaries are at the British Library in London. And he said, hey, this is a great danger here. The Bolsheviks, hey, they're fanatics. When you're dealing with extremists, how do you deal with them? Well, they only respect force. They only respect force. Well, the Soviet offensive into Poland fails. The Poles rally. There's a poster, Poles to the bayonet, under Marshal Pilsudski. They win the Great Battle of Warsaw in August of 1920 along the Vistula River. Well, again, Britain's concerns are with communist Russia, Europe, America. Murder by the throat. What's this about? Something close to home, Ireland. In January 1919, Sinn Féin, Irish representatives elected to the British Parliament, they decide they're not going to sit in Westminster. Instead, they set up their own parliament in Dublin, and they write a Declaration of Independence. And this is what a quotation out of that English rule is based upon force and military occupation, and that Ireland should be united and free to British rule. So right close to home, Britain is also facing now a war. And indeed, through 1920 and into 1921, the war begins to escalate a great deal. And Lloyd George, Prime Minister, is writing to Churchill and saying, hey, we're made to look silly by De Valera, the head of the Irish. You know, hey, we've got to do something here. Right close to home, we can't be looking at losing out to the IRA and Sinn Féin. Indeed, Churchill, as Secretary of State for War, has some responsibilities for the fighting of this war. And as a consequence, he starts to enlist some auxiliaries to help the Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force, fight against the IRA. Again, the famous black and tans. A lot of these are soldiers from the First World War who find employment by being part of the security forces. Of course, they have a notorious reputation in Ireland for the acts of counterterrorism, terrorist counterterror that they use against the IRA. Indeed, Churchill's wife, Clementine, writes to Churchill at one point and says, hey, you know, sometimes I don't like this hardline stance that you're always doing in public. You're too Hunnish. The Germans are the Huns in the First World War. You're behaving like the Germans. That's not good, Winston. And that is a picture of Clementine with their daughter, Marigold, their fourth child. Unfortunately, Marigold died just before the age of 3 from an infection that today would be cured by antibiotics. Well, the head of the Imperial General Staff, uniformed head of the British Army, says, hey, the fool, the Prime Minister, he doesn't understand what's going on in Ireland. It's not just about Ireland. There's this vast conspiracy out there against the British Empire. It's in New York, America as a rival. It's in Cairo, Egyptian nationalists. It's in Calcutta, Indian nationalists. Moscow, the communists. They're all against England. And they're using Ireland as a lever to tie down Britain. And what's the solution? A good shooting. Good shooting will solve the problem. That's what we need. Martial law. Again, if you think Churchill's hard line is hard, well, the British Army had a different approach. And again, the politicians, they're useless. They don't want to face up to the responsibility of what's going on there. Well, Churchill would later write in the aftermath that with regard to Ireland, the advice he got from the military authorities were generally unhelpful when it came to Ireland. Now, Lloyd George, in a very famous speech, the pressure on the Irish nationalists is quite intense. And indeed, Britain is turning the tide against the IRA. Lloyd George says, we have murder by the throat. We're going to defeat them. Well, who's opposed to the Brits? Michael Collins. And he sees that this tide is turning. He becomes interested in negotiation. While a committed Irish nationalist, committed to independence, he sees all of a sudden that he could lose the war. And he's the master strategist from the Irish side. It's a fascinating case study of a terror war. And he comes to the conclusion that despite this hatred, the emotion, that he has to try to get the best deal that he can, that there ought to be negotiations. And even though he's done what Churchill said are terrible deeds, the acts of a terrorist, if you will, and he's been difficult to kill, he's one of the persons, that the British want to kill and capture, he realizes, hey, there ought to be a settlement here. There ought to be a settlement. And indeed, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, Sir Henry Wilson, the head of the British Army, says, hey, the British Empire is doomed. This is such a sellout. And Churchill afterwards wrote and said, the emotions brought out by this Anglo-Irish War of independence is huge. And there's Churchill and Michael Collins' signature on it. What happens after the Anglo-Irish War ends, you then have green on green as the Irish nationalists fall out amongst themselves. Those who see this treaty as a sellout, who see Michael Collins as a traitor. And so what happens is the British start arming Michael Collins against those who are opposed to the treaty, anti-treaty and treaty factions in Ireland. You have a civil war. In fact, the civil war is more violent than the Anglo-Irish War as measured in dead bodies. More Irish are killing each other than British are killing them. And indeed, Collins is in the midst of this fight and eventually is ambushed and killed. But his side wins. His side wins. And again, his death, while it takes out someone who was in favor of the treaty, nonetheless, his life has become mythic, that he gave up his life to try to bring about a peace settlement for Ireland. And again, there, silence, work is done. These are Churchill's words about Michael Collins. Churchill came to admire and respect Collins a great deal, even though he wanted to earlier hunt down and kill Michael Collins. Supposedly, Michael Collins, at the end, before he was killed, sent back a note to Churchill saying, tell Winston we couldn't have won this civil war without the help that he gave them. Okay, now we're back to the Middle East. Okay, there's method to my madness here. I can see some of my colleagues going, why isn't he talking about the Middle East? Well, because it's a global superpower. There's a lot going on. The Middle East is one theater to this global superpower. They're faced by an American rivalry. They're faced by a threat from communist Russia. They're faced by a threat right at home in Ireland. So all of these things are on their plate. Indeed, Ireland looms large in the minds of British leaders at this time. Well, let's look at the greater Middle East. Britain's facing uprisings, communal violence in India. 1919, a war in Afghanistan. It's also facing endemic fighting on the northwest frontier, modern-day Pakistan. Nationalist unrest in Egypt. violence in Palestine, major uprising in 1920 in Iraq. All of this is going on, and the British are trying to control and manage this. And finally, too, a war between the Turks and the Greeks. Well, in 1920, this uprising in Iraq looks like it's the straw that's going to break the camel's back. The British forces are stretched all over the world. And indeed, it doesn't look very good initially. And Lawrence of Arabia, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, writes a letter published in the Sunday Times. And as you can see, what does it say? Hey, in Mesopotamia, we've been led into a trap. Again, honor, that word of Thucydides. How do you get yourself out of a mess like this in an honorable way? And again, things are worse than what the government is letting on. We're not far off from a disaster. Boy, this sounds like U.S. in 2005-06. Indeed, this letter was often cited and quoted, right, Michael? By Michael Duran, by people who were trying to compare 1920 to the situation in Iraq. Well, how important is Iraq? Self-interest here. Let's do a calculation. Well, Churchill, as Minister of War, says, hey, we've got a pretty big bill there for Iraq and Palestine and Persia. You're going to face a shocking bill. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy is saying they want to recapitalize, rebuild after the First World War. What's more important, spending money on Iraq or spending money to get the next generation of naval weaponry? That's the trade-off that you're going to face if you have a 10-year rule of tight defense budgets. For Churchill, let's compare the two. And again, what is the cost just greater than the value of this place called Iraq? And I love this language here. Living on an ungrateful volcano. Do you want to live on an ungrateful volcano? Wow, that's wonderful Churchillian language. And in no circumstances get anything worth out of it. It's not worth it. I'm doing my cost, my calculation. Not worth it. Lloyd George's response is, boss, hey, if we leave Iraq, what's going to happen? The French and the Americans will get in there. Some of the world's richest oil fields. He's saying to Churchill, you can't just think about our cost. You've got to think long term. Who's going to benefit? Who's going to gain from this? It'll be our rivals in the world. The Middle East has to be seen in a larger geopolitical rivalry with other powers. And again, on principle, he's against what he calls a policy of scuttle, be it in Ireland or in Iraq. Again, this is mirrored today in the work of Ali Nasser in his recent book, Dispensable Nation. Ali Nasser is the head of the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, DuPont Circle in Washington, basically saying, hey, the rivalry today and what's going on in the Middle East has to be seen as part of a larger rivalry the U.S. has with China. Again, you can't just look at the region in isolation. You have to look at the region in a wider perspective. Well, what's the Army's perspective? Well, they're fighting wars all over the place. And Henry Wilson is saying, hey, within the financial limits, the Army's stretched thin. I'm trying to create an all-volunteer force. We've ended conscription. And I'm trying to create this new Army. And it's being tied down everywhere. We can't afford it. You're going to break the Army this way. Strong nowhere, weak everywhere, no reserve. Dangerous situation. This is the problem that Wilson sees the Army is facing. So how does Britain keep the costs low of trying to manage all these problems in the Middle East? Well, there's an answer. It's called drone wars. Aerial policing. Sir Hugh Trenchard, the Royal Air Force, a new service created on April Fool's Day, 1917, during the First World War. The Royal Air Force is looking for a mission. If the Army doesn't want to do the job, if the Army feels overstretched, if boots on the ground are too expensive, is there some way that technology can be harnessed to help police this vast new empire that Britain has taken over in the Middle East? And the Royal Air Force under Sir Hugh Trenchard, Chief of the Air Staff, says, yes, we can do it. Airplanes can keep a whole country more or less under surveillance. offensive action day after day, without intermission, until success is assured. That this is the low-cost alternative to boots on the ground. You don't need to have a large ground footprint taking casualties on the ground. What you can do is use technology and small, here, airplane flying over Mosul, technology of aircraft with special forces, what we would call special forces, highly trained, very well armed, small numbers of elite formations, working together with the Royal Air Force and what they would call local levies, local police and military forces, to suppress rebellions, to help police this vast empire. And indeed, it does come down the cost of the British Empire dramatically to a cost that Britain can afford, this aerial policing. What gets expensive for Britain is to have to deploy large armies on the ground. Again, we see the modern analog, Samuel Huntington, the late Samuel Huntington, in his book Clash of Civilizations, in talking, this is written in the 1990s, highlighted that the war with Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups, it's basically a war of terrorism against air power. And indeed, Britain is looking at the situation in a similar way. Well, Churchill moved over from the War and Air Office to take over the Colonial Office with a special responsibility for the Middle East. And as you can see, the cartoons of the time are giving him a new hat. And again, look at that caption. Specialty in hats you can't talk through. There's Lloyd George giving it to him. Churchill, by the way, at that time was known for his hats and the different hats that he liked to wear. We think of Churchill with the cigar, but at the time it was Churchill and hats. And here he is in Cairo, the famous Cairo Conference, where the boundaries of the modern-day Middle East being formed, again with his wife, and with Gertrude Bell and Lawrence of Arabia. Again in Palestine, again in the 1921, visiting the region, the boundaries being drawn up. What brings down the Lloyd George government is a Middle East crisis brought on by a war between Greece and Turkey. Greek ambitions are to create a greater Greece with Constantinople as the capital for this greater Greece. Turkish nationalists opposed to this, and indeed on the ground, the Greeks lose. The Greeks have been backed by the British in their endeavor. Well, Turkish forces led by Kemal Ataturk are driving toward the Dardanelles. This is right back to Gallipoli in 1915 again, in 1922. It leads to a crisis. Is it going to be the case that Britain's going to become involved in a war with the Turks over the Middle East? Should they take a hardline stance or not? Lloyd George, who is very much devoted to the Greek cause, wants to take a harder line stand at first, and it looks like there's going to be war. Eventually, the British negotiate with the Turks. A settlement is reached. Throughout the interwar period, though, the British remain concerned about Turkish ambitions, especially toward Mosul and northern Iraq. You'll see when you look at the British documents in their cipher school, they had broken the codes for the Turkish diplomatic service, again, NSA type of stuff, and they were reading a lot of the Turkish diplomatic cipher because they were always concerned about Turkish ambitions in the region throughout the 20s. Lloyd George wanted to take the hardline stance, but the conservatives start to rebel against him. And indeed, the head of the conservatives, Andrew Bernard Law, writes to the Times, "We can't act as policemen of the world. Britain's been through a great war, the great war. There's war weariness. It's time to retrench, avoid wars." Well, the loss of conservative support leads to a general election in Britain in the fall of 22. And in that election, the conservatives come out clear winners over the opposition, and Bernard Law becomes the new prime minister, Lloyd George out. Churchill, who was a backer of Lloyd George, is one of those persons who loses his seat. He loses in his constituency up in Dundee. He had his appendix removed right before the election. At that time, a very serious operation, pre-antibiotic age. As you can see, he's going right at election time, right before the polling day, being escorted by his bodyguard and one of his political handlers, his wife behind him, to go give a talk at his constituency. He was being hooted down in most of his speeches. He was seen as being too far to the right at this point. Well, anyways, he later wrote, after he had his appendix removed, that not only did he lose his appendix, but he also lost his office, his government position, and also his seat. And he was more getting estranged from liberals as well, and moving more toward the conservatives. Well, for Churchill, out of office, out of government, time to paint. Indeed, painting as a pastime is an essay that Churchill wrote that is well worth reading. He's actually quite a good painter. Churchill's contribution, well, here are some thoughts about that. Again, my purpose here today was to put the Middle East story, when people say, oh, the boundary lines were being drawn up by the British at this time, and that has led to all the endemic violence that we see down to the current day, has to be remembered that Britain's dilemmas in the Middle East are part of a larger story of Britain trying to recreate a world that had been close to being lost in the Great War and the First World War. That the Middle East is just one consideration, one concern for British leaders at this time. It was not the only focus of their attention at this time. And so, in understanding the British position in the Middle East at this time and the decisions that they made, it is important to think about the entire British global position. And that's what I've tried to do today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Just as Michael expanded the time frame of his assignment, John expanded the geopolitical frame of his assignment to our benefit. We'll take questions. Again, please wait for the mic to arrive at your station. Turn up your 10 card if you have a question in the back.
Is this on? Yeah. You talked a little bit about Churchill's relationship to Iraq in the 20s, and I wonder if you could say something about what the relationship was between Britain and Turkey after Ataturk came to power as we moved through the 20s?
Yeah, very, very interesting question. As I alluded to at the very end of my talk, the British were always concerned that the Turks were going to take over the Kurdish portion of Iraq. And make sure that what is the exact boundary line between the Turkish state, new Turkish state, and the new Iraqi state. And so the British paid special attention throughout the 20s to what the Turks were doing and saying and writing. Indeed, this is a fascinating story in that only about 10 years ago now have the NSA equivalent, if you will, of the British diplomatic spying been released, and what becomes clear in the National Archives in Britain, they're called the HW12 papers, and I've gone to look at these papers, not exhaustively because they will exhaust you, but any historian. But it's fascinating to look at what the British were doing and reading at this time, and to a remarkable extent, they're focused on the Balkans. They're interested in what Mussolini is doing. They're interested in Yugoslavia, Greece, Turkey. A large percentage of the eye of British intelligence when it comes to deciphering diplomatic traffic is on that region, that troubled region that Professor Reynolds talked about in the Balkans down to Basra. The other countries that they're interested in are Japan, because Japan is an emerging naval rival, and so there's a number of decrypts that they do there on Japan, and they also are decrypting American diplomatic ciphers. Indeed, throughout the whole interwar period, they're reading a lot of the State Department's cable traffic to keep a close eye on what the Yanks are doing. What's fascinating is that at one point, the British Prime Minister in the early 30s, Ramsay MacDonald, actually tells the American ambassador by the name of Bingham that the British are reading the American diplomatic codes out of the embassy. And for whatever reason, Ambassador Bingham didn't take it on board and never reported it. And so the British continued to read these things until 1941, in December of 1941, when Churchill came to Washington after Pearl Harbor. When he was meeting with Roosevelt, he told President Roosevelt in an offhand way, you know, our cipher people have been able to decrypt your diplomatic ciphers, and that means if we can do it, the Germans probably can too. You better move to a more secure system. So to get back to your original question, they are very interested in what's going on in Turkey. They're always concerned about Turkey and Iraq until the mid-20s.
Over here.
Hi. Given the context of your talk with England and their policy in the Middle East, could you more specifically address the varying white papers towards Palestine, maybe specifically the Churchill white paper of 1922?
Throughout all of this period of time, there's incredible back and forth among British leaders about how to deal with Palestine. They initially see this as being something of a great boon to the Middle East, that it's going to lead to economic development, and they seriously underestimate the amount of violence that's going to take place there. And you see this in both Balfour and Churchill, that they didn't expect that there would be as much Arab resistance to what went on. And in fact, they were somewhat blindsided by this. And the amount of violence in Palestine throughout the interwar period soon leads the later British leaders to review and say, was this a good idea, the commitments that we took on? And again, we're back down to honor and cost again. In 1938, at the time of the Munich crisis, when the British are facing Nazi Germany, they have deployed a large army to try to pacify Palestine. Several divisions of British troops are in Palestine. And so the British leaders are, throughout the interwar period, are increasingly concerned that what has happened is that they've taken on a commitment here that's going to destabilize the Middle East. You know, part of what British rule is like, and again, you can see this in Ireland, to some extent in the Middle East as well, you know, and it's typical of a lot of imperial powers, is that you play off people against each other. And that's how, you know, for the Chinese, for the Romans, it's you get the barbarians to fight each other, you know, and that's one way of imperial rule. You keep the people on the other side, you know, fighting. The British, with regard to Palestine, are looking at this and saying, this type of violence, though, is upsetting the whole region. And indeed, throughout this period, the British are very conscious that they're the largest Muslim power in the world. And so they don't want to see, in some way, a clash of civilizations take place, as Sam Huntington would call it. Indeed, during the First World War, they had a taste of this because the Germans, leadership under the Kaiser, was trying to incite, if you will, a clash of civilizations, of trying to raise up Muslim outrage against British rule. So by the late 20s and 30s, the British are much more concerned that they've taken on more than they can handle in the Middle East.
Over here. Just wait for the microphone.
Joseph Ostrowski from Travis Early College High School, San Antonio. My question, sir, is the backstory behind Churchill and his relationship to the Kurds, especially after World War I, and the promise of a homeland for those people.
Yes, well, again, there are more expert people who can talk about the Kurds in the Middle East than I can. But of course, the Kurdish people are what, the single largest national group in the world that doesn't have a state of their own? And again, how are you going to create that state without creating a lot of violence? And indeed, the victory of the Turks in their war against the Greeks, again, who has the power to create a Turkish state, which is going to be, or a Kurdish state, which is going to have to be formed out of territories of modern-day Syria, Turkey, and you know, Iran. And so, you know, throughout this period, it's just too much. There's no way that you can create a Kurdish state without a considerable amount of force from the outside, and Britain doesn't have that force. So that's my short answer, but you should talk to people who know more about the Middle East than I do.
Javier? I'll wait for the...
How do we understand the coming into being of the Balfour Declaration, given all of the economic, cultural, and political considerations that must have gone into it? How is it possible that people that were so weak were given such a major gift, in a sense?
It was because it was seen as the contribution that the Jewish community in Britain was making to the war effort, that people like Balfour, Churchill were well disposed to this. And again, something that needs to be highlighted is that when they were making these commitments in the Balfour Declaration, they didn't expect what they eventually got. So they saw this as relatively low cost, not only low cost to them, but that it was something that was going to bring about economic development in the region, that this was part of a larger imperial venture that was going to have long-term payoffs in the future. So they saw the benefits high, the costs low, and so that was what their thinking was. Now, it turned out to be different from what they expected, and indeed you start to have some very strong sentiment against Jewish sentiment on the part of the British leaders, as the interwar period goes on, and then in the aftermath of the Second World War. So British leaders changed their mind considerably about that undertaking.
We have time for one more question. Right there.
Hi. What lessons can we learn from the British in the Middle East at this period? There were some implications. You're talking about some more modern day examples. How can historians and the FPRI kind of help to change current situations and future situations that are parallel to this time period?
No, that's an excellent question. A policy-oriented question of thinking about today. And indeed, trying to come and grapple with that is an important question. And, in looking at what the British experience is in the Middle East in this period of time, one of the things that I find most remarkable is how the British are able to hold down the costs and achieve their most important interests in this region throughout the interwar period. Now that makes me, I think, something of a minority point of view from many people who look at this period. But when you look at the core British interests, which is secure access to oil, secure lines of communication across the Middle East to the empire in Asia, and doing it at as low cost as possible, they have been able to achieve those goals. Now, in doing that, they've also alienated a lot of locals in what they've done because they are an outside imperial power. At the same time, though, they're trying to find people within the region with whom they can work to help secure these core British interests in the region as well. So I think one of the takeaways that I would have from this is that today I think there's something of a backlash about the U.S. Position in the Middle East in the wake of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And I think there's a danger that there will be such a drawdown that American power, the United States, will become too weak in the region, that there'll be a pendulum swing, and that will abdicate responsibility for that region more than we need to do, that there are lower cost, honorable, if you will, alternatives to a policy that Lloyd George would call scuttle. So there are ways of backing those forces in the region who we see as supporting our interests and also promoting, I would say, better government in the Middle East. So I think that would be one of the takeaways, that in the wake of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, that we shouldn't have a pendulum swing that says, oh, we have to isolate ourselves from the region and withdraw from the region somehow completely. It's just too dangerous, and hunker down into a homeland security bunker mentality to protect ourselves against al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. I think that type of pendulum swing would be dangerous, and I think the British model shows that there are potential alternatives to that I think that are within the cost, and cost shouldn't be just measured as dollars and cents and lives, but also cost in the sense of American public opinion as well, and our ability to look at ourselves in the mirror as moral people and say that we're doing the right thing, not just protecting ourselves, but trying to promote and enhance better rule within in the Middle East as well. So I think that there are ways that we can do that that aren't too costly to the United States. So that would be my big takeaway.
Okay, join me in thanking John Maurer.